On the 4th of July, 1946, something happens that casts fear into the hearts of the old European powers, while simultaneously serving as a beacon of hope for millions of people still under the yoke of these same old European powers. On that day, the United States of America fulfills a more than a decade-old promise. Before the fires of war devoured much of the globe in 1934, the United States and the Philippine Senate signed the Tidings-McDuffie Act, also known as the Philippine Independence Act. In it, the United States promised the Philippines independence, a promise they now fulfill. I am Sebastian Brandstetter, and welcome to Season 1 of TimeGhost Cold War coverage in our series War to War, where we follow the wars that wouldn't end within a Cold World War, the beginning of the digital age, the atomic age, and the space age, when we began to replicate our minds electronically, gained the power to end our very existence as a species, and discovered that we can truly reach for the stars. The US behavior in the Philippines does, however, raise an important question. Why does the US lend a hand to Philippine independence, while at the same time abiding France, Britain, and the Netherlands and their brutal reassertion of power within their colonial empires? The answer lies in a new global confrontation that is brewing, East against West, communism against liberal democracy, the United States against the USSR, and the fear it creates in West and East alike. By now, two things are known fact: the Soviet infiltration of pretty much every Western government, and their ambitions to bring about the collapse of the Western world order and the dictatorship of the global proletariat. George Kennan makes this perfectly clear in his long telegram sent from the US Embassy in Moscow to the State Department in February this year. At least on an ideological level, the confrontation between East and West is set in stone, or, ink. In this context, a disorderly evaporation of European colonial power could lead to chaos. Chaos that the local communists could use to their advantage. This is something that the US does not want. Each communist success could serve as a bonfire to other colonies, and soon the world, once firmly under the grip of European nations, could transform into a communist wave with enough momentum to sweep liberal democracy and free markets aside. Such thoughts, however, are already far beyond the realm of mere possibility, teetering on the edge of reality. The Second World War brought chaos to the possessions of colonial empires, and the first wars of independence are already raging or one spark away from cataclysmically erupting. And today, we begin in the Dutch East Indies, a vast colony spanning thousands of islands, home to some 30 million people by 1930, and 7 times the size of the United Kingdom. Dutch control, dating back to the 16th century, collapsed during World War II when Japan swept through Southeast Asia, casting aside European rulers. From 1942 to 1945, Indonesia then fell under Japanese occupation, which, though exploitative, fostered nationalism. The Japanese allowed the use of the Indonesian flag, promoted the national anthem, and even formed local military units. By the war's end, the seeds of revolution have been sown, setting the stage for an explosive struggle against returning colonial rule. On August 17, 1945, mere days after Japan's surrender, Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta declare Indonesian independence. Patriotic fervor sweeps Indonesia as hundreds of thousands celebrate. For Europeans and Japanese still in Indonesia, it is a nightmare. Violence erupts against real and perceived former oppressors. However, that does not matter to the Dutch and the British. They are determined to restore European rule. Initially, they are supported by the US. Uncle Sam is worried that an independent Indonesia could be fertile ground for communism. While the Dutch struggle to mobilize in light of German occupation, the British take the lead. Rather than calm the storm, this fans the flames, and the British are met with harsh resistance from day one. Retaliatory strikes against the locals follow suit, like in Surabaya. The Dutch assembling a motley crew of local Dutch militias and sending troops from Europe doesn't help either. For the Netherlands, giving up the colony is out of the question because of its economic and political significance. While the British withdraw in 1946, the Dutch press on, and attempts of compromises are made, like the Linggadjati Agreement, but ultimately fail because no side is satisfied with the results. The chaos also brings renewed support for local communist groups, something that the USSR welcomes but that alerts the United States. If the Dutch fail to re-establish their authority, the US interest may be better served by accepting the democratic Indonesian independence movement rather than risk a communist resurgence. And in the end, that is the path the US will follow. This means that despite their stubbornness, the Dutch will have to yield, and Indonesia will win its independence. And because the US switched sides, if you will, it looks like it will be a new non-communist state. This underlines what I said at the beginning of today's episode. The US is not supporting the colonial empires out of loyalty or friendship, but simply because it is in its geopolitical interest. As soon as this changes, US support wavers and ultimately turns like a flag in the wind. Before we move on, if you want to know more about the conflict in Indonesia, check out our mini-series about it right here on the TimeGhost channel. It covers everything in much more detail. Just across the South China Sea, in French Indochina, similar events are unfolding. French Indochina, a vast colony in Southeast Asia stretching from the borders of China in the north to the Gulf of Thailand in the south, covers roughly 740,000 square kilometers and is home to over 23 million people. As in Indonesia, the Japanese occupation swept aside European rule, and after Japan's surrender, the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, seized control of Hanoi and declare independence. Again, the returning colonial power refuses to relinquish its hold, and, as in Indonesia, the British briefly step in. This time, however, facilitating France's return. When the French violate a compromise agreement in Shell Haiphong in November 1946, killing thousands, the Viet Minh launch a full-scale uprising, plunging Vietnam into war. If you want to follow how the First Indochina War unfolds, check out our live coverage. The first episode is already out right here on the TimeGhost channel. One reason why the British are forced to withdraw from these brewing colonial conflicts, Indonesia and Indochina for instance, is that the British Empire has its own issues to deal with, and potentially the biggest one concerns the jewel of its crown. British India, a subcontinent of a colony stretching from the Himalayas in the north to the Indian Ocean in the south, is home to nearly 400 million people. That's 1/5 of the world's population. It encompasses diverse ethnic, linguistic, and religious communities, with Hindus forming the majority and Muslims constituting about 1/4 of the population. Governed as a key part of the British Empire for nearly 2 centuries, its sheer size and complexity itself pose a challenge. The power of the British Empire is waning, and nowhere is a better example than India. The subcontinent is on the brink of a political and social catastrophe. As is the case in most, if not all other colonies, the war has changed everything. Economic strain, returning Indian soldiers, and rising nationalist demands question whether the colonial rule is still sustainable. However, I should mention that the problems in India are not a phenomenon that began because of the war. Mahatma Gandhi's salt marches in the 1930s were a definite sign of an underlying economic and cultural tension that had been brewing in India for generations. Gandhi exposed the unfair and harsh treatment of Indians at the hands of the British. On bended knees I asked for bread, and I have received stone instead. And with his demonstrations of civil disobedience against British rule, he inspires millions of Indians in years to come. It is in this context that the voices demanding Indian independence grow ever louder. And while the British do at least make a show of engaging with these demands, no concrete proposals follow. Then, Nazi Germany invades Poland. Now Britain needs to walk a tightrope. They cannot risk a full-out rebellion in India, since they needed support to defeat Germany, soldiers, resources, and much, much more. At the same time, Britain also does not want to lose the colony altogether by promising full independence. That is why the British refuse, despite Indian leaders making it a condition for their full support during the war. First, with the August Offer of 1940, and then the Cripps Mission of 1942, the British proposed at first vague and later definite promises of dominion status to India. The Indian Congress turns down both proposals because they do not go far enough. Instead, they demand immediate independence and launch the Quit India movement. At the same time, Gandhi initiates another civil disobedience movement against what he deems India's forced participation in the war. Both are brutally suppressed by the British colonial government, further taxing its already strained resources. More than 2 million Indian soldiers end up fighting for Britain regardless. With the war over, the political unrest intensifies. The Indian National Congress, INC, led by Nehru, Gandhi and Patel, pushes for immediate independence. However, the conflict is not contained to India v. Britain. There is also a religious divide within the colony now coming to the fore. The Muslim League under Muhammad Ali Jinnah demands a separate Muslim state, Pakistan, arguing that Muslims will never have equal rights in a Hindu-majority India. The British attempt to negotiate, sending the 1946 cabinet mission to broker a compromise. The plan proposes a federated India, but both the INC and the League reject it. Congress fearing a weak center, the League fearing Hindu domination. Frustrated, Jinnah escalates the situation. On August 16, 1946, the Muslim League calls for a direct action day to show Muslim strength. It spirals into one of the deadliest riots in Indian history. In Calcutta, Muslims and Hindus turn on each other, leaving over 4,000 dead and 100,000 homeless. The unrest spreads. Bihar, Noakhali, the Punjab, and elsewhere witness massacres, revenge killings, and forced migrations. The Royal Indian Navy mutiny of February 1946 in Bombay is another drop in a barrel already overflowing, spreading to Calcutta, Karachi, and Madras. It involves 20,000 sailors and is violently suppressed, with over 200 killed and 1,000 injured. Everywhere you look, British power in India is fading. And for the British, one thing is clear. India is now firmly beyond their control. Confronted with violence from all sides and overwhelmed and overburdened by the administrative and logistical tasks of ruling over India, Britain decides that now, in 1946, that it needs to leave. But many unanswered questions remain. When will the British leave? Is a swift and immediate plan of action required, or can the British draw out the death throes of its largest colony? Can partition along ethnic lines somehow be avoided? Something that could very well set up the region for conflict in the years to come. And lastly, who could even oversee such a monumental task? Could it be the decorated war hero and relative of the future Queen and her consort, Lord Mountbatten? We shall see as War to War returns to India in 1947. Unlike what we've seen so far, the European colonial powers do not always stand together. Under the searing sun of the Middle East, which has seen countless empires rise and fall, France and Britain pretend that it's not the year 1945, but rather 1845, and engage in the colonial power struggle that exemplified the 18th and 19th centuries. The Levant, stretching from the eastern Mediterranean to the deserts of Mesopotamia, is a region of vital strategic importance. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1918, both Britain and France were granted League of Nations mandates to stabilize and govern the region. The French took charge in Syria and Lebanon with a combined population of around 5 million souls. Like in the case of Vietnam, the resurgent France under Charles de Gaulle refuses to let go of the vestiges of imperial might it retains. To now abandon Syria and Lebanon would not only damage France's global prestige, but also set a dangerous precedent for its other colonies, especially in North Africa. De Gaulle also hopes to secure long-term economic and military privileges, including control over air bases and cultural institutions, ensuring that French influence remains strong even if former rule should end. There's just one problem. Britain has the exact same aspirations. Syria and Lebanon are also part of their Middle Eastern strategy, linking Egypt, Iraq, and their mandate in Palestine in a colossal imperial network. During the course of the Second World War, both powers promised the Arab leaders independence in exchange for varying concessions, and the British even assured the French that they would be able to re-enter the region. This web of competing promises sets the stage for disaster. By the May of 1945, tensions between the two colonial powers boil over. While Britain supports an orderly transition to independence, France attempts to reinforce its hold and, against Britain's expressed wishes, deploys additional troops amid a tidal wave of renewed Arab national sentiment. To no one's surprise, well, maybe Charles de Gaulle's surprise, the inhabitants of both Syria and Lebanon act out against continued French oppression. On May 29, 1945, to definitively quell the unrest, French forces shell Damascus, bombarding the Syrian parliament and surrounding neighborhoods. Hundreds die, and the entire district burns as nationalist leaders are arrested or forced into hiding. Charles de Gaulle is seemingly willing to risk everything, including the fracture of his own cabinet, to preserve the French colony. To stop the French madness, or so they say, on June 1st, British forces cross into Syria, severing French supply lines and surrounding key positions. Winston Churchill demands an immediate ceasefire, but Charles de Gaulle refuses. Over the next weeks, British and French commanders engage in tense standoffs, with the British blocking French reinforcements and disarming key French garrisons. French forces retreat to their barracks, isolated and outmaneuvered. As the situation deteriorates, diplomatic pressure mounts. The newly formed Arab League demands full French withdrawal, while the United States voices its disapproval of the continued French colonial ambitions. Outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered, with diplomatic pressure mounting from all sides, the last French troops leave the region in April 1946. Syria becomes a fully independent state on April 17, 1946, and Lebanon finally transforms from titular to actual independence in August, with the departure of the last troops stationed there. While the British may celebrate this success, on paper, they are now the colonial hegemon of the region, in reality, the situation in Mandatory Palestine is equally dire. The clock on British rule in the region is also ticking. Lying at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, Palestine is a land of ancient histories and clashing futures. Bordered by the Mediterranean to the west and the deserts of Transjordan to the east, it is a narrow strip of land, no larger than Scotland, yet home to a deeply divided population. For nearly 3 decades, the British have ruled it under a League of Nations mandate, but now as their empire teeters, so does their control. Torn between competing promises, one to the local Arab population who were assured independence during the First World War, and the other to the Zionist settlers granted a homeland through the 1917 Balfour Declaration, Britain has tried and failed to balance the seemingly irreconcilable. As with France and Britain's contradictory pledges in the Levant, these competing promises lay the foundation for a lasting conflict. By the 1930s, the contradictions in British policy erupt into violence. Palestinian Arabs, fearing their homeland is being taken from them, launch a full-scale revolt from 1936 to 1939. The British response is swift and brutal. Tens of thousands of troops are deployed, entire villages are bombarded, and mass arrests paralyze the uprising. By 1939, the revolt is crushed, but at a cost. The British, desperate to calm the Arab fury, issued a white paper of 1939, drastically limiting Jewish immigration and promising an eventual independent Palestine under an Arab majority. For the Zionist movement, this is betrayal, just as Nazi persecution in Europe makes Jewish refuge a matter of life and death. Then, war breaks out. The Second World War forces a temporary pause in the conflict. Both Arabs and Jews focus on survival, and for the moment, Palestine is not high on Britain's agenda. But the tension never truly disappears. As soon as the war ends, it explodes again. Jewish underground militias, outraged by the continued immigration restrictions, turn their guns on the British. The Irgun and Lehi, the Stern Gang, launch attacks on government buildings, train stations, even bombing the King David Hotel this year, killing nearly 100 people. Meanwhile, Palestinian Arabs, still reeling from their failed revolt, look to the Arab League for support, determined to block any Zionist state. As in India, some voices within the House of Commons and Lords ask if Palestine is worth its price in British blood and tears. Perhaps, like India, it is time to leave. We shall see in 1947. So there we are. The sun is setting on the old and mighty colonial empires of Europe that conquered and subjugated much of the world, whether it be Britain, France, or the Netherlands. Their struggle against the tides of a new age seemed to be stuck in the colonial mud. The smoldering conflicts in Asia and the Middle East will have far-reaching consequences and shape the world for decades to come. If you suppose that the freedom of one oppressed nation will inexorably lead to the next and the next, it seems that the first dominoes have begun to fall, and Britain, Belgium, and France now cast a weary gaze toward the cradle of humanity. Africa, the last continent to be colonized, now appears to be destined to be the last to regain independence. Or will the powers of the old world, against all odds, find a way to defy this unstoppable wave of change? But the fledgling new states stepping out of the colonial shadow are far from entering into a bright new age free from foreign influence. Instead, they are being greeted by two new behemoths standing over them and watching their every move. The United States and the Soviet Union, each with their own agendas, seem committed to initiate a new age of dominion when colonies become spheres of influence and imperialism comes in the guise of promises of freedom through ideology. As we enter 1947, the ebbs and floods that erode the shores of an old world in its death throes seem to get deeper and more powerful, strengthened by new ideals for humanity. The only guarantee is that these waves will change everything. But will it be true change? Or just a change of foreign masters in the battered lands? In our next episode, the whole War to War team of hosts, including me, Sparty, Indy, Astrid, and Anna, will return to you to give you an overview of the news that dominate 1946. It is the TimeGhost army that makes this great adventure a reality. The TimeGhost Army member of the week for War to War is Nicolas Ruiz. Be like Nicholas and join the TimeGhost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Let's dive deep into history together. That's how we keep the content coming, so that together we can shine a light on some of the most important events of the past. Excelsior!